Where are we at in European football in 2025 is a question that I have been thinking about ever since we've just got the last round of each European competition, and I think the results are very telling. Let's take a look at what the state of European football is in this current modern game. It comes particularly from the Barcelona PSG game that we have just watched on Wednesday night, where PSG I think reminded everyone of who they actually are, reigning, defending European champions, beating arguably their toughest challenger. Now listen, there's a lot of circumstances, players missing, especially for PSG, and I don't think anyone really expected them to go there and win without the likes of Dembele, Doué, Kvaratskhelia, Neves, Marquinhos. They were missing some key players from their Champions League win last season. But that result, along with a lot of other factors, have kind of made me think and got me thinking as to where we are in the European game right now and whether this PSG team can go on to sustain a period of dominance, because it's a lot rarer than you might want to remember. Now, in the Champions League, if we actually look at consecutive winners, you'll find that it's such a rare commodity in Europe's elite competition. Real in 2017, obviously their famous side winning it 3 times consecutively. They were the first side to do so when they did win the second in 2017 for 27 years, and that dates back to the 89-90 season when AC Milan won consecutive titles. Now, if you look back across history in the Champions League, you'll find it's such a rare thing. Even when you're thinking about, the dominant sides we do see in the Champions League, that, arguably the greatest team ever in that Barcelona side from the late 2000s into the early 2010s, they never won it consecutively. They won it twice in 3 years under Pep Guardiola. And you can look back to the early 70s, obviously, when Bayern were the dominant force. They won it 3 times in a row. Liverpool in the late 70s, early 80s were the dominant side in Europe. But it's something that we just, obviously there's a lot of different factors and components that go into making a dominant side. But I beg the question whether this PSG team has all the tools available to them to go on and be a dominant force in the Champions League over the next 2 to 3 years. With the way the European game is now set up and the way it's evolved, I think that constant change and that constant cycle of football that will continue to happen for its existence. We've seen it in every single era where there's always it's always evolving, there's always changing shape. And with the way it's set up now, with the huge emphasis on tactical systems, on collectiveness, I think we've seen that individual element almost not vanish, because I do think that there are still small parts of it in the game, but I think the emphasis on the unit and a system and a whole team being focused on that one goal is why I think it's become a little bit more difficult for one single side to go on a dominant run in Europe. I think another big factor is this massive increase in fixtures and congestion, and now with the top sides like a PSG or like a Barcelona having to play or can play potentially up to 60-70 games across a whole season, with all of these new competitions being introduced. These players now have to factor in playing internationally in the Nations League now, where there's been an increase in fixtures, or at the end of, well, now every 4 years with the Club World Cup and that new format that's been introduced. Even the Champions League itself, of course, with that new format where there's more games in the group phase, having an extra 2 games to play, potentially a playoff round if they don't finish in the top 8. So whilst I do think that new format has brought in a lot of positives, I think it's also a big reason, or adds to the reason, as to why we've not really seen a dominant Champions League team since that Real Madrid side. Now, let's particularly look at the last 5 years in the Champions League first, where since 2020 we have seen 4 different winners and only 1 repeat winner, that being Real Madrid, of course, the kings of Europe in 2022 and 2024. But this last 5-year stretch has seen, I think, a shift in the power play and if you will, the balance of power across Europe and in each country, especially the top 5 leagues, where we are seeing the winners be a lot more spread out. We are seeing silverware being shared a lot more rather than we maybe have seen, especially in the previous 10 years, where we saw Spain just dominate the Champions League and the Europa League. From 2010 to 2020, we saw Spain win both competitions 6 times respectively in that 10-year period. And if we look at the eras before that 10-year stretch and the 5 years since, I think we're looking at a much more open field in regards to those European competitions. I do think the key, meanwhile, to having that sustainable success in Europe, especially in today's modern game and the way it's evolved, is about striking that balance between that collectiveness and allowing your top players to really carry you through to the finish line. And if we look at how PSG did that in 2025, particularly at Luis Enrique, who is just a phenomenal coach, he not only eliminated that selfish element or perhaps that individualistic element that remained at the club for so many years in their pursuit of the Champions League. He brought in young, hungry talents like a João Neves, like a Kvaratskhelia, and paired that with maturity and those experienced names like Dembele and like Marquinhos, Donnarumma, who's obviously now left the club. And we saw the results of that in the Champions League last season. They were just a phenomenal side to watch. But I think, looking also at the fact that they have the youngest squad currently in the Champions League, they were only the second French side to win the Champions League after Marseille in 92-93, and I think all of these factors combined could make them a perfect side in the game today to go on a dominant run in the Champions League. But a big factor that is in the way, and as I alluded to before, with this collective emphasis and this tactical emphasis rather in the game in 2025, it also means that there are 4, 5, 6 other top sides in Europe that are a real threat. And again, another reason as to why it's going to be so difficult for one single side to go on a dominant period in the Champions League. Ultimately, I do think we're in a really excited stage and state in European football right now, where we are looking at 5 or 6 real contenders to the Champions League this season. And if we're particularly looking at Arsenal and Liverpool in England, Real Madrid and Barcelona in Spain, Bayern Munich look to be a real threat with Harry Kane on absolute fire, and then obviously PSG, who you'd have to say are the favourites. Listen, we're still very early in the competition and just 2 games in, but once we do get to those knockout games, I think it's going to be such a thrilling time in football to see where it goes. But this current period we're in right now, with all those teams and contenders that I've just named, I think it does bring you back, and it's particularly similar to the 2000s, where there was such an influx of quality across Europe, and we had a number of different winners from 2000 to 2010. I believe only Barcelona and AC Milan were repeat winners in that period, but we had the likes of Bayern Munich and Porto, obviously the great story in that era, Manchester United in 2008, and Liverpool obviously with their win in Istanbul, Inter obviously capping off that period of time under Jose Mourinho, it was thrilling to be a fan and to watch the European game unfold. And I think it's becoming really similar right now. Perhaps not in the way tactically that we're in. I think there was a greater feeling or emphasis on individual talents back then. If you look at the likes of Ronaldinho and Kaká and Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi in that period of time. But I think with the way there's such an openness in the Champions League this season and over the last 5 years, in fact, that it feels really similar to that period of time in Europe, and I think it's something we should all be looking forward to. But that is where I'm going to end this video on the current state of the modern European game, and I think it's something that we should all be keeping an eye out for and all following as the season progresses. But thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.